Joining me now is the President's National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan. Jake, welcome back to Meet the Press.
Thanks for having me, Chuck.
I want to start right there. Secretary Blinken last week and you throughout the week have been very seriously concerned over what China could be doing. President Biden seemed to downplay that risk there. Is that his gut, or do you have new intelligence suggesting the Chinese are backing off?
Well, we have the same intelligence that we've had that has been behind the comments Secretary Blinken has made and what you just heard from President Biden, which is we have not seen China yet provide military equipment to Russia for purposes of fighting in the war in Ukraine. We haven't seen it yet. We're continuing to watch. We'll stay vigilant, as President Biden said, but so far we haven't seen it. Do you have a sense of what why they would make a decision to do this? What would be their strategic reason for doing it if they did it? It's a great question, Chuck, because I don't think it is in China's interest to do this. I think it would alienate them from a number of countries in the world, including our European allies, and it would put them foursquare into the center of responsibility for the kinds of war crimes and bombardments of civilians and atrocities that the Russians are committing in Ukraine. Their weapons would, in effect, be used for the slaughter of people in Ukraine. So I think it would be ill-advised for China to move forward. But of course, that's a decision Beijing is going to have to make for itself. Other than saying there would be consequences for getting involved, you or anybody else has not laid out any specific consequences. Why not? Why not go public with what could be the consequences, whether it's on sanctions, whether it's weapons or troops to Taiwan? Why not lay it out in public? Well, we believe that this is better done directly with Chinese counterparts in private. And in fact, Secretary Blinken had the opportunity to meet with China's top diplomat at the Munich Security Conference just a few days ago. So we have channels to be able to make sure that China fully understands the U.S. position and what would happen were they to move forward with this step. And we don't see as much profit in microphone diplomacy on this. I understand that. Do you have the Western allies on board with the immediate response that you want to do with China, or is that going to be a slog? We've actually had intense and very positive consultations with our NATO allies, with other members of the coalition supporting Ukraine. And in fact, Chuck, they're taking steps themselves to communicate to Beijing. Senior officials from Europe are directly talking to senior officials in China, expressing their own strong warnings about China moving forward in this regard. So you believe that the severe consequences the U.S. would level, that our European and NATO allies would go along with them? Well, in staying away from microphone diplomacy, I will stay away from hypotheticals. All I will say is that we have had extremely effective, constructive discussions with our European allies about this contingency. I think we're all on the same page about our concern, our alarm were this to happen. We all see the same thing right now, which is China has not moved forward, and we will deal with the circumstance should it come to pass. Is the peace plan that China put out, many United States administration officials have essentially dismissed it out of hand, but President Zelensky didn't. What do you make of his decision, and is that a smart move by him? Well, what President Zelensky said were there were parts of the plan he didn't like and parts of the plan that he thought could be okay. One part of the plan that I particularly liked is point one of the plan. Point one of the plan was respect the sovereignty of all nations. The plan could just stop there because Russia could end this war by respecting Ukraine's sovereignty and pulling out. But what President Zelensky also said, and this is critical, Chuck, is that he would like to speak to President Xi. China put forward this plan without having had a single conversation since the war began between President Xi and President Zelensky. The Chinese have talked to the Russians a lot, but at the most senior levels, they have not talked to the Ukrainians. And it's very difficult to advance any kind of peace initiative when there's that kind of one-sided diplomacy going on. So from our perspective, the critical thing is that any peace plan offered by anybody has to involve the input of Ukraine. As President Biden has constantly said, nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. And that goes for this initiative as well as any other initiative under the sun. Let's talk about some of the
some of the, I'll call it, I guess, criticism, if you will, from some Democrats who believe that there is more aid that needs to be sent to Ukraine, and it needs to happen faster, including the F-16s. I want to play an array of folks: Jason Crow, Mike McFaul, former ambassador to Russia, and Jared Golan. Take a listen.
They need more aircraft. They need more advanced aircraft. So that's why we've been pressing the administration on a bipartisan basis to help them advance their Air Force, to give them what they need to fight and win.
I think if you want victory, we have to do more. We're not giving them the weapons they need for this counteroffensive that they're planning in the spring. And I think time's going to run out.
Some people have raised concerns about training. Well, last September, many of us called on the administration to start training in F-16 or fourth generation aircraft. And of course, that hasn't even begun. So the time to start this process is right now.
And Jake, it's that last comment I want you to respond to directly. I understand you say the F-16s are not something they need right now. But to Congressman Golden's point, why not start training Ukrainians on this now so that when we inevitably do this, or likely do it, they're ready to use them?
Well, first, Chuck, it's important for people to understand that Ukrainian pilots are currently flying day in and day out. They are flying their Soviet-era fighters, MiG fighters, Sukhois, and the coalition is providing spare parts for those planes to ensure that they can stay in the sky. So, first of all, we are providing a substantial amount of support to the Ukrainian Air Force for the limited kinds of missions that the current war calls for them to undertake. Secondly, the central focus of all of our efforts right now is to help them take back territory that Russia currently occupies. Right. And the assessment of our military commanders, those giving advice to President Biden, are that what they need right now are tanks and armored personnel carriers and infantry fighting vehicles, artillery and air defense systems up there on the front line. That's what we're giving them, and we're giving it to them fast. We're giving it to them in large quantities. And the question of F-16s is really a question for another day, for another phase. This phase is about ground combat and being able to have the tools in the hands of the Ukrainians to take the territory back that the Russians are occupying.
I'm just curious, why not take the F-16 talking point off the table, going, you're right, we're going to provide them with that help down the road because you've said we're committed to Ukraine's security in perpetuity?
You know, it's really, at the end of the day, not our job to focus on the talking points question, or, you know, what the right thing to say on a Sunday show or in some other public forum. It's our job to figure out, morning, noon, and night, what does the Ukrainian army need on those front lines, and how do we get it to them as rapidly as possible? And we have moved with unprecedented speed and at unprecedented scale to get them a massive amount of military assistance so that they have been able to defend effectively and to take back half of the territory so far that Russia previously occupied during this war.
Simple question, and I know it's got a complicated answer. What does victory look like for Ukraine?
That's up to Ukraine to define. It has been critical to us, and I said it just earlier in this interview, that there be nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. And so it's not for the United States to define victory for Ukraine. It's for the United States to support Ukraine on the battlefield so that they can achieve the victory that they define. That's what we are determined to do. We believe they can achieve that, and we are going to give them the implements, the tools that they need to be able to achieve that.
Well, if that's the case, Ukrainian President Zelensky did define victory, what he thought victory looked like in August of last year. He said, Crimea is Ukrainian, and we will never give it up. This Russian war against Ukraine and against the entire free Europe began with Crimea and must end with Crimea, with its liberation. There's always been a hesitance among U.S. officials, Jake, and I know you're included here, about Crimea specifically, and it's always been, well, it's up to Ukraine. Well, President Zelensky said it. Victory is all of the territory back. Why don't we say the same thing now? Well,
we have repeatedly talked about Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity in its internationally recognized borders. The question for us is, how do we put Ukraine in the best position on the battlefield so that they are ultimately in the best position at the negotiating table? And President Zelensky, as recently as this week, has said we're going to have to ultimately get to a diplomatic phase of this conflict. So from our perspective, our goal is to strengthen the hand of the Ukrainians on the battlefield so that they are in the strongest position with the most leverage when they get to the negotiating table to ultimately achieve an outcome that restores Ukraine's full sovereignty and territorial integrity.
If they want to take Crimea militarily, will the United States help Ukraine do that?
Chuck, the critical thing right now is that they need to take back the territory in the south and the east that they are currently focused on, and we need to give them the tools to be able to do that. The question of Crimea and the question of what happens down the road is something that we will come to. Where we are right now is that we need to be focused on the immediate term because it is critical that we move fast and we move decisively to help them take back the territory across that line of contact that Russian troops are currently occupying.
It sounds like you think the ideal outcome is Ukraine is able to take more territory back. Putin fears that he could lose Crimea, and he comes to the negotiating table to see if he can keep Crimea. Is that the best case scenario you're envisioning?
Again, I understand why you're asking the question, but you have to understand that from the United States' perspective, we're not going to negotiate over the destiny and sovereignty of another country. That is for their democratically elected president to decide. What we are going to do is give Ukraine the tools that it needs, as I said before, to be in the strongest possible position, to ultimately be able to convert battlefield gains into diplomatic leverage. That is the goal here, and that requires us to achieve those battlefield gains through the provision of military assistance to Ukraine.
In the open of our show, people are seeing footage of a Chinese fighter jet warning an American fighter jet over the South China Sea earlier this week. We happen to have a reporter on board of that. It only underscores just all the tension we have with China. Just in the last couple of weeks, we've had a 7-hour meeting with Taiwanese officials. We're sending more troops to Taiwan. China's ignoring calls from our defense secretary. Secretary Blinken had to cancel his trip. The president wants to have a call with Xi. There's no evidence that anything's been scheduled. This lack of communication, how dangerous is this situation with China right now?
Well, we have said repeatedly that we need to have military communications channels to avoid escalation, to avoid surprise, to avoid mistake. And it is unfortunate that the Chinese Defense Ministry has declined to take calls from the U.S. Secretary of Defense. That's on China, because from the U.S. perspective, for the rest of the world, we are acting responsibly. We are prepared to have those lines of crisis communication. We had them during the Cold War, at the height of the Cold War, when the U.S. and the Soviet Union were squaring off. But, Chuck, we do have the ability to speak to China at high levels. And as I mentioned, Secretary Blinken spoke with his counterpart, the top diplomat of China, Wang Yi, at Munich just a few days ago. So it is not that all lines of communication are shut off, but rather that we do not have the military-to-military exchanges that we think are necessary to ensure stability.
Do we have anything scheduled with the president and Xi on a phone call in the near term?
Nothing scheduled at the moment, though I anticipate the two leaders will speak at some point in the not-too-distant future. All
right. Jake Sullivan, the President Biden National Security Advisor. As always, sir, thank you for coming on and sharing the administration's perspective.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.